The winter of 1848 had settled over Ashwood Hall like a shroud, the kind of cold that seeped through stone walls and velvet curtains to lodge itself in the bones of those who dwelled within. Lady Georgiana Fairfax sat at the mahogany dining table in her usual place, the one closest to the draughty window, and wondered if her uncle had positioned her there deliberately, or if it was merely another small cruelty of circumstance that she had learned to endure without comment. 3 years had passed since her father's death in a sun-drenched valley in Greece. 3 years since Professor Edmund Fairfax had succumbed to a fever while excavating what he believed to be an undiscovered temple. 3 years since Georgiana's world had contracted from the modest but comfortable life of a scholar's daughter to this half-existence as a perpetual guest in her uncle's home. The dining room glittered with false warmth, crystal chandeliers ablaze with what must have been 100 candles, their light refracting through cut glass to cast dancing patterns on the silk-papered walls. The table groaned under the weight of the evening's feast, roasted pheasant and venison, delicate fish courses, vegetables glazed and arranged with artistic precision, all of it planned by Georgiana herself in her role as unofficial household manager, a position she occupied without title or acknowledgement. She had suggested the menu to cook 3 days prior, had reviewed the wine selection with the butler, had even arranged the hothouse roses that served as the centerpiece. Yet when her uncle Lord William Ashwood complimented the presentation, he directed his praise to his daughter Beatrice, who had done nothing more than choose which gown to wear. Georgiana's hands rested in her lap, hidden beneath the table's edge, where no one could see how tightly she gripped her napkin, her knuckles white beneath gloves that had been darned twice and were growing thin at the fingertips. At 26, she occupied that peculiar purgatory reserved for unmarried women of gentle birth but insufficient fortune, too well-bred for employment, too poor for independence, too old by society's merciless calculations to harbour reasonable hope of marriage. The fire roared in the massive hearth, yet the heat seemed unable to reach her corner of the room, and Georgiana wondered if she would ever feel truly warm again, or if this persistent chill had become a permanent condition of her existence. Movement near the sideboard caught her eye as it always did, an unconscious habit she had developed over 3 years, the tracking of one particular servant among the many who glided through Ashwood Hall's rooms like ghosts in livery. Edmund, the footman whose Christian name she knew only because she had once overheard the housekeeper use it, stood in the shadows with perfect posture, a silver tea service balanced on one white-gloved hand. She knew his routine as well as her own, had learned the rhythm of his service. Without meaning to, the way he appeared each morning at precisely 8 o'clock to serve her breakfast tea, the angle at which he held the pot, the careful silence with which he performed his duties. There was nothing remarkable about him at first glance. A tall man, perhaps 30 years of age, with dark hair and features that might be called handsome in better light, dressed in the Ashwood livery of deep blue and silver that marked him as property of the household. Yet Georgiana had noticed things about him over the years, small inconsistencies that nagged at her scholar's mind, trained by her father to observe details others missed. His hands, for instance, were not the rough, calloused hands of a man born to service, but rather long-fingered and elegant, the hands of a musician or a writer. His posture, while appropriately deferential, held a quality of natural authority that no amount of bowing and scraping could entirely disguise, and his eyes, dark and intelligent, seemed to absorb everything while revealing nothing, watching the family with an attention that felt less like servitude and more like study. She had never spoken more than a handful of words to him beyond the usual courtesies required between mistress and servant, and he had never addressed her except to inquire about her preferences regarding tea or to murmur the occasional necessary phrase in that low, carefully modulated voice that gave away nothing of his thoughts or origins. Yet in 3 years of silent coexistence, Georgiana had come to feel that Edmund saw her in a way no one else in this household did, that when his eyes met hers for those brief seconds as he placed her teacup before her each morning, she was not invisible, not merely the poor relation tolerated out of familial obligation, but a person of substance and worth. It was a foolish fancy, she knew, the desperate imagination of a lonely woman seeking recognition anywhere she might find it, even in the impersonal service of a footman who probably thought of her no more than he thought of the furniture he dusted. The crystal chandeliers above the table seemed to grow brighter as Beatrice Fairfax, Georgiana's cousin, and the undisputed beauty of the family, raised her left hand to admire the ring that adorned her fourth finger, a massive sapphire surrounded by diamonds that caught the candlelight and threw blue fire across the table. Beatrice was everything Georgiana was not, golden-haired and rose-cheeked, blessed with the kind of effortless beauty that required no artifice, possessed of a comfortable confidence that came from never having doubted her place in the world. At 21, she had rejected a dozen proposals, holding out for the most advantageous match, and now it seemed her patience had been rewarded beyond even her considerable expectations. "The Duke of Wentworth has finally chosen a bride," Beatrice announced, her voice carrying the particular musical quality of triumph barely restrained by good breeding. They say he is frightfully particular, having refused every suitable lady in England for a decade. But he saw my portrait at the Rothermere ball and was quite determined to make me his duchess. The announcement should not have surprised Georgiana, who had watched the courtship develop over the past months through letters and gifts that arrived with increasing frequency. Yet hearing it stated so boldly, so finally, sent a small, sharp pain through her chest. Not because she harbored any romantic feelings toward the mysterious Duke of Wentworth, a man she had never met, and who by all accounts had not been seen in society for years, but because the engagement represented everything she would never have: security and status, a future and a purpose, the transformation from Miss to Her Grace, from dependent relation to mistress of one of England's great estates. Lord Ashwood, a portly man whose success in trade had purchased his title, but not the instinctive grace that should accompany it, beamed at his daughter with unconcealed satisfaction. "An excellent match, my dear, excellent indeed. The Duke's estates in Northumberland alone generate an income of 40,000 a year, to say nothing of his properties in London and Yorkshire. You have done very well." He turned his attention to Georgiana with the abrupt shift that characterized all his interactions with her, as if he had to remind himself of her presence each time he looked in her direction. "Georgiana, you must begin considering practical arrangements. Your small inheritance will not last forever, and you cannot impose on our hospitality indefinitely. Perhaps a position as a governess or companion might be suitable. Several families of my acquaintance are seeking women of education and refinement for such roles." The words landed with the weight of stones, each one a small violence disguised as practical concern. Georgiana felt heat rise to her cheeks, the twin humiliations of poverty and spinsterhood laid bare before the assembled company, as casually as one might comment on the weather. She opened her mouth to respond, to say something that might preserve her dignity, but found her throat too tight for words. It was in this moment, as she struggled to maintain her composure, that Edmund materialized at her elbow with the silent efficiency that characterized all his movements. "More tea, Miss Fairfax?" His voice was barely audible, pitched low and deferential, yet something in its quality cut through the roaring in her ears and anchored her to the present moment. She looked up to find him standing closer than strict propriety required, the silver teapot tilted at precisely the angle needed to pour without splashing, his eyes meeting hers for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. In that brief connection, she saw something she had not expected, a flash of what might have been sympathy or understanding, or perhaps anger on her behalf, there and gone so quickly she could not be certain she had not imagined it. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted her cup to receive the steaming liquid, the fine porcelain chattering almost imperceptibly against the saucer. "Yes, thank you," she managed, her voice steady despite the tumult within. Edmund poured with practiced precision, the amber stream arcing perfectly into her cup, and she found herself focusing on this small ritual as a drowning person might focus on a piece of driftwood. The tea was prepared exactly as she preferred, she realized, with just the amount of sugar she favored and a precise measure of milk, details she had never explicitly communicated, but which he had somehow learned through 3 years of silent observation. It was such a small thing, this perfectly prepared cup of tea, yet in this moment it felt like an anchor, a reminder that at least one person in this household paid attention to her preferences, even if that person was a servant performing his assigned duties. Beatrice continued to hold court, describing the Duke's letters with their expressions of admiration, the plans for a wedding in June at St. George's in Hanover Square, the renovations she intended to make to Wentworth Abbey once she took possession as its mistress. Georgiana sat very straight in her chair, her face arranged in an expression of polite interest that revealed nothing of the despair churning beneath the surface. 3 years of charity, she thought. 3 years of being reminded at every turn that she existed here on sufferance, that her presence was tolerated rather than welcomed, that she consumed resources and provided nothing of value in return except unpaid labor disguised as familial contribution. Even the servants must pity me, she reflected, and immediately her eyes sought Edmund, where he had retreated to his position by the sideboard. He stood perfectly still, his face impassive, yet she had the strangest sense that he was aware of her gaze, that some part of his attention remained fixed on her even as he stared straight ahead in the manner of well-trained servants everywhere. Through the tall windows behind him, snow fell in thick curtains, transforming the Kent countryside into a study in white and grey, beautiful and isolating in equal measure. The landscape seemed to mirror her own situation, she thought, outwardly peaceful and even lovely, but cold and inhospitable beneath the surface beauty. Her uncle's voice broke through her reverie as he dismissed her late father with casual cruelty. Poor Edmund was always a romantic fool, chasing antiquities in Greece when he should have been securing his daughter's future. A scholar's passions are all very well, but they do not pay bills or arrange marriages. Georgiana's fingers tightened around her teacup until she feared the delicate porcelain might crack. Her father had been the kindest, most brilliant man she had ever known, a professor of classical studies whose work had been respected throughout Europe, whose integrity and gentle wisdom had shaped everything she valued in herself. That he had died pursuing his life's work, excavating ruins under a Greek sun, seemed to her the most honorable of endings. Yet here it was reduced to foolishness, to a failure of practical sense. She wanted to defend him, to speak of his contributions to scholarship and his devotion to truth, but she knew from experience that such defenses would only invite more criticism, more pointed reminders of her dependent status. Instead, she took a careful sip of her tea, letting the warmth spread through her, and allowed herself a single glance at Edmund. Their eyes met across the expanse of the dining room, and in that moment something passed between them. An acknowledgement, perhaps, or a shared recognition of the cruelties being perpetrated beneath the veneer of civilized dinner conversation. His expression remained neutral, perfectly appropriate for a servant, yet Georgiana could have sworn she saw something flicker in those dark eyes, a spark of fellow feeling that made her suddenly acutely aware that she was not entirely alone in this house of casual cruelties and calculated indifference. The moment passed as quickly as it had come, Edmund's gaze returning to the middle distance, his face settling back into lines of professional blankness. Yet Georgiana found herself watching him for the remainder of the meal, noting the way he moved through the room with unconscious grace, the intelligence evident in his careful attention to details, the quality of controlled strength in his bearing that seemed at odds with his position. Who was this man who had served her tea every morning for 3 years, who prepared it exactly to her preferences without being told, whose eyes held depths that no servant's eyes should contain? The question nagged at her as Beatrice's voice rose and fell, cataloguing the Duke of Wentworth's many perfections, as her uncle calculated aloud the social advantages of the connection, as the meal dragged on through course after course of food Georgiana could barely taste. When at last the interminable dinner concluded, and she was free to retreat to her small chamber in the east wing, Georgiana carried with her not thoughts of her cousin's triumph or her own humiliation, but rather the memory of Edmund's eyes meeting hers, and the unsettling certainty that there was far more to the invisible footman than anyone in Ashwood Hall had ever bothered to notice. Sleep would not come, not after the humiliations of dinner, not with Beatrice's triumphant voice still echoing in her mind, not with her uncle's casual dismissal of her father burning like acid in her chest, and so Georgiana found herself slipping from her cold chamber at midnight, drawn to the one place in Ashwood Hall that still felt like sanctuary. The library had been her refuge since childhood, visits to her uncle's estate, and in the 3 years of her residence here, it had become the single room where she felt she had any right to exist without apology or explanation. Her uncle cared nothing for books beyond their value as decorative objects that signified wealth and cultivation, and Beatrice found reading tedious unless it involved fashion plates or romantic novels of the most frivolous sort, which meant the library remained blessedly unpopulated, a kingdom of leather and paper where Georgiana could breathe without the constant weight of obligation and inadequacy pressing down upon her. She carried no candle as she made her way through the darkened corridors there. Knowing the route by heart, her stockinged feet illant on the cold marble floors. The house settled around her with the particular creaks and sighs of an old estate in winter, timbers contracting in the cold, wind-rattling window panes, the distant sound of someone in the servant quarters closing a door. She pushed open the heavy oak door to the library and stepped inside, expecting darkness and solitude, expecting to find the room empty as it always was at this hour, and so the sight that greeted her stopped her completely, her hand still on the doorknob, her breath catching in her throat. Edmund sat in her uncle's favourite leather chair, the wing-back positioned near the dying fire, and he was reading. Not merely holding a book as one might hold any object, but truly reading, absorbed in the text with the kind of focused intensity she recognized from her father's study, from her own late-night sessions with difficult texts. A single candle burned on the small table beside him, its flame casting golden light across his face, and in that light he looked entirely different from the impassive footman who had served her tea just hours earlier. He had removed his livery coat and sat in shirt-sleeves, his waistcoat unbuttoned, his cravat loosened, looking relaxed in a way she had never seen him, looking like a gentleman in his private study rather than a servant stealing moments in his master's library. The book in his hands was substantial, leather-bound and clearly old, and as Georgiana's eyes adjusted to the dim light, she recognized it with a shock of recognition that sent her heart racing. It was a volume of Aristotle, the Greek text her father had kept in his own library, the same edition he had read to her on winter evenings when she was a girl, learning the alphabet of that ancient language. Edmund held it with the ease of familiarity, his eyes moving across the page with the fluid comprehension of someone who truly understood what he read, and Georgiana felt the foundations of everything she thought she knew about this man crack and shift beneath her. He had not yet noticed her presence, so absorbed was he in his reading, and she stood frozen in the doorway watching him, her mind racing through 3 years of interactions, every moment of service, every carefully neutral expression, every instance of that strange sense she had that he saw more than a footman should see. Who was this man who read? Aristotle in the original Greek at midnight in her uncle's library, who sat in that chair with the unconscious authority of someone accustomed to claiming space rather than deferring to others, whose very posture in this unguarded moment suggested education and breeding far beyond what his position indicated. The floorboard beneath her foot creaked, and Edmund's head snapped up, his eyes meeting hers across the room, and she watched as something remarkable happened. For a single heartbeat his face remained open, showing surprise and something else, something that looked almost like relief or recognition, or perhaps a kind of weary resignation. And then the transformation occurred, the mask slamming back into place with such speed and completeness that she might have imagined that moment of genuine emotion. He stood abruptly, the book falling closed in his hands, his shoulders assuming the deferential curve of a servant caught where he should not be, his eyes dropping to the floor in the manner of one acknowledging transgression. "Miss Fairfax," he said, and even his voice had changed, taking on that careful neutrality he always employed, yet she could hear the strain in it now, could detect the effort required to maintain the pretense. "I apologize. I should not be here. I will leave at once." But Georgiana had seen too much, understood too much in that unguarded moment, and she found herself moving into the room rather than retreating, closing the door behind her with a soft click that seemed unnaturally loud in the silent library. She should let him go, should pretend she had seen nothing, should maintain the proper distance between mistress and servant, but the events of the evening had stripped away her capacity for pretense, and besides, her scholar's curiosity, the quality her father had nurtured and her uncle dismissed as unbecoming, was fully aroused. "You read Greek," she said, and it was not a question but a statement of fact, spoken with the wonder of someone discovering an entirely new species of creature in a familiar garden. "The book in your hands is Aristotle's Metaphysics, the Becker edition, which contains the original Greek text without translation." Edmund's hands tightened on the volume, his knuckles whitening, and when he looked up at her, his eyes held a complexity of emotion she could not entirely pass, wariness and calculation, and beneath it all, a kind of desperate hope. His accent, she noticed, had shifted slightly, the careful servant's diction giving way to something more refined, more educated, though he seemed to be fighting to maintain his usual speech patterns. "My mother believed education was the right of every man, regardless of his birth," he said slowly, each word chosen with visible care. "She taught me before she died. I have been teaching myself Greek these past years to better myself, to perhaps one day secure a position of greater responsibility." The explanation was plausible enough on the surface, the sort of improving tale that might be told of an ambitious servant seeking advancement, yet everything about the scene contradicted it. The ease with which he had been reading suggested years of study, not the halting progress of a self-taught amateur, and the particular edition he held was a scholar's text, not the simplified versions used for beginners. Moreover, there was something in his manner, in the way he held himself even now as he tried to assume appropriate deference, that spoke of natural authority rather than learned subservience. Georgiana moved closer, her eyes on the book in his hands, and found herself speaking without conscious thought. "That is Aristotle's Metaphysics. My father used to read it aloud to me. I have not thought of those evenings in years." She paused, memories rising unbidden, her father's voice in the fire-lit study, his patient explanations of difficult concepts, his delight when she grasped some nuance of the ancient philosopher's argument. He believed that true education should be shared regardless of gender, that women were as capable of understanding philosophy as men if given the opportunity. It was an unfashionable view, but he held it nonetheless. Edmund's face transformed at her words, the mask slipping again, and she saw naked emotion there, grief and understanding and a fierce intelligence that made her breath catch. "Your father was Professor Fairfax," he said, and his voice had changed entirely now, the servant's careful tones giving way to the cultured accents of an educated gentleman. His monograph on Athenian pottery is considered definitive. The scholarship was extraordinary, combining archaeological evidence with textual analysis in ways that revolutionized the field. He stopped abruptly, seeming to realize what he had revealed, and she watched him struggle to pull the servant's mask back into place. "That is, I have heard it said in the household," he finished weakly, the words utterly unconvincing. The silence that fell between them was heavy with implications, with questions that could not be asked, and truths that could not be spoken. Georgiana felt her heart beating fast, felt the familiar library transformed into something strange and dangerous, a space where the rules that governed the rest of the house did not seem to apply. What Footman knows of academic monographs? Edmund? She asked quietly, and there was steel beneath the softness of her voice, the tone of someone who would not be deflected with convenient fictions. What servant reads Aristotle for pleasure at midnight? Who are you really? He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw the battle waging behind his eyes, the weighing of risks and revelations, the calculation of how much truth could be safely offered. "I am no one, Miss Fairfax," he said finally, and the resignation in his voice cut at something in her chest. "I am exactly what you see, a footman in your uncle's household, a servant who has overstepped his bounds. Here, this is improper. Forgive me." He moved as if to leave, to escape through the servant's door that connected the library to the back corridors. But Georgiana found herself stepping into his path, not touching him, but close enough that he would have to push past her to leave. She did not know what possessed her, what drove her to this breach of every rule of conduct she had been taught. But the image of him reading by candlelight had awakened something in her, a hunger for intellectual connection she had suppressed for 3 years, a desperate need to be seen and understood by someone who might actually comprehend the loss she carried. "Please," she said, and heard the nakedness in her own voice, the plea for something she could not quite name. "Please do not insult my intelligence with obvious falsehoods. I do not know who you are, or why you serve as a footman when you clearly have the education of a gentleman, but I would appreciate the courtesy of honesty, or at least the acknowledgement that we both know the situation is not what it appears." Edmund stood very still, close enough now that she could see the pulse beating at his throat, could smell the faint scent of sandalwood, and something else, perhaps book leather or candle wax. The fire in the grate had burned down to embers, casting dancing shadows across the floor-to-ceiling shelves that surrounded them, creating the sense of a private world carved out of darkness and flickering light. Outside the tall windows, snow fell in thick silence, blanketing the Kent countryside, muffling sound, cutting them off from the rest of the house, the rest of the world. The library had always felt like a sanctuary to Georgiana, but now it felt like something more. A space outside the normal rules of society, a room where impossible conversations might occur and forbidden connections might form. She became suddenly acutely aware of her state of undress, wearing only her nightgown and wrapper, her hair unbound and falling down her back, standing closer to a man who was not her husband or relation than propriety would ever permit. The impropriety of it should have sent her fleeing back to her chamber, should have made her step away and reassert the proper distance. But instead she found herself holding her ground, waiting for his answer with a patience born of 3 years of watching and wondering. "I cannot tell you what you want to know," Edmund said at last, and his voice was low and rough, stripped of both servant's deference and gentleman's polish, just the raw sound of a man pushed to his limits. "There are reasons, Miss Fairfax, reasons that have nothing to do with you, and everything to do with obligations I cannot escape. I know it is maddening. I know you deserve better than evasions and half-truths, but I cannot give you more. Not now, perhaps not ever." The confession hung between them, honest in its very refusal to provide answers, and Georgiana felt something shift in her understanding of this man. He was not simply playing at being a servant for reasons of his own amusement or criminal intent. There was genuine constraint in his situation, genuine pain in his inability to explain himself. She wanted to press him, to demand answers, but something in his expression stopped her, a vulnerability that made her instinctively gentle her approach. "Then tell me this," she said softly. "Are you in some kind of trouble? Are you hiding from something or someone?" Edmund's mouth quirked in what might have been the ghost of a smile, bitter and self-mocking. "In a manner of speaking, yes. I am hiding in plain sight, Miss Fairfax, and have been for longer than you know. It is not a situation of my choosing, and yet I cannot seem to find my way out of it." He paused, seeming to consider how much more to say, and then added with quiet intensity, "But I want you to know that the moments I have spent in this library, the books I have read here, they have been the only genuine freedom I have known in years. This room has been a sanctuary for me as much as it has been for you." The admission created an intimacy between them more profound than any physical closeness could have achieved. The recognition of two souls seeking refuge in the same space. Two people invisible to the rest of the household, finding solace in leather-bound volumes and ancient wisdom. Georgiana felt tears prick at her eyes, overwhelmed by the strange tenderness of this midnight encounter, by the shocking discovery that she was not alone in her isolation, that this man she had watched for 3 years had been watching her in return, seeking the same escape she sought. Without thinking, acting on pure instinct, she moved to the shelves and reached for a book on a high shelf, one of her father's volumes on Greek antiquities that she had been meaning to retrieve for weeks. Her fingertips barely brushed the spine, the book tantalizingly out of reach, and before she could step back to find the library ladder, Edmund was there, reaching past her, his body close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. His hand closed on the book at the same moment hers did, both of them gripping the worn leather spine, and the contact sent a shock through her entire body, electric and utterly inappropriate, and undeniable. They stood frozen, hands touching on the book, his chest nearly pressed against her back, his breath stirring the loose hair at her temple, and Georgiana felt every rule of propriety she had ever learned dissolve in the face of this overwhelming awareness of him as a man rather than a servant, as someone who saw her and understood her and desired her if the sudden tension in his body was any indication. The moment stretched, impossible to sustain and impossible to break, until the distant sound of footsteps in the corridor outside shattered the spell. Edmund pulled away as if burned, the book coming free in Georgiana's hands, and she turned to find him already backing toward the servant's door, his face a mask of controlled panic. "Someone is coming," he said urgently, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "You should not be found here with me. It would ruin you." And then he was gone, slipping through the concealed door with the silent efficiency of long practice, leaving Georgiana standing alone in the dim library, her heart hammering, her hands trembling around the book on Greek antiquities, her father's passion made tangible in leather and paper and gilt edges. The footsteps passed by the library door without pausing, probably just a housemaid on some late errand, But the interruption had been enough to remind them both of the danger inherent in their situation, the impossibility of what had almost happened in that moment of connection. Georgiana sank into the chair Edmund had vacated, the leather still warm from his body, and opened the book with shaking hands. Inside the front cover, she found her father's bookplate, his name inscribed in his familiar hand, and beneath it a small notation in different ink, recent and unmistakably Edmund's writing. The note read simply, "Page 47." And when she turned to that page, she found a passage marked lightly in pencil, a description of archaeological methods her father had developed, techniques that had revolutionized the study of pottery fragments and their significance in understanding ancient daily life. That Edmund knew this book well enough to reference specific pages, that he had taken the time to mark passages that might interest her, suggested a level of attention and consideration that went far beyond the duties of a footman, far beyond even the intellectual kinship of two scholars finding each other in unlikely circumstances. She sat in the chair until the candle burned low and the fire died completely, the book open on her lap, her mind churning through everything she had learned and everything she still did not know. Edmund was not what he seemed, that much was certain. He was educated far beyond any servant, familiar with her father's academic work, capable of reading ancient Greek with apparent fluency, and burdened by some obligation that kept him trapped in a position utterly at odds with his abilities and breeding. He had been in this library before, many times judging by his comfort in the space, and he had been reading her father's books, studying them with enough care to mark passages he thought she might appreciate. The impossibility of the situation pressed down on her like a physical weight, the vast gulf between her dependent status and his servant's position, the complete inappropriateness of any attachment between them, the scandal that would erupt if anyone suspected the nature of their midnight encounter. Yet beneath the rational understanding of all these obstacles, Georgiana felt something else stirring, a fierce joy at having been truly seen, truly understood, perhaps for the first time since her father's death. Edmund, whoever he really was, recognized her as an intellectual equal, someone capable of appreciating ancient philosophy and archaeological scholarship, someone worth marking passages for, someone worth the risk of discovery in a midnight library. She touched the page where his pencil mark lingered, tracing the faint line with one finger, and felt the strangest sensation, as if the 3 years of invisible service, all those mornings of perfectly prepared tea, all those moments when their eyes had met across crowded rooms, had been leading inevitably to this night. This revelation, this impossible connection that could never be acknowledged in daylight, but which had nevertheless irrevocably altered the landscape of her carefully constrained existence. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The library became their world, a kingdom of candlelight and whispered conversation that existed outside the rigid hierarchies of daylight hours, and over the 6 weeks that followed that first midnight encounter, Georgiana found herself drawn there each night with the inevitability of tides pulled by the moon. Edmund was always already there when she arrived, as if he could sense the moment she would slip from her chamber and make her way through the darkened corridors, and she wondered if he waited for her, if he spent his evenings watching the clock until the hour grew late enough that the rest of the household had retired, and they could claim this stolen time for themselves. They spoke of philosophy at first, safe intellectual territory that allowed them to maintain some pretense of propriety, discussing Aristotle's theories of causation and Plato's forms, debating the merits of Stoic philosophy versus Epicurean thought with the kind of engaged intensity Georgiana had not experienced since her father's death. Edmund's knowledge was extraordinary, far exceeding what any self-taught servant could have acquired, demonstrating familiarity not just with the classical texts themselves, but with contemporary scholarly debates about interpretation and translation, referencing recent archaeological discoveries in Greece and Italy that had been published in academic journals to which no footman would have access. When she mentioned her father's work on Athenian pottery, Edmund could discuss specific arguments from the monograph, could debate fine points of dating methodology and stylistic analysis, could even suggest connections to related scholarship that her father might have found illuminating. It was impossible, all of it utterly impossible, and yet night after night he proved himself her intellectual equal, or perhaps even superior, someone who had clearly received the finest education available to young men of the highest social standing. She began to notice other details that contradicted his servant's position, small things that accumulated into an overwhelming body of evidence that Edmund was not what he claimed to be. His hands, which she found herself studying with perhaps more attention than was strictly proper, were long-fingered and elegant, unmarked by the calluses and rough skin that characterized men who performed physical labor, the nails neatly trimmed and clean in a way that suggested habits of grooming more appropriate to a gentleman than a footman. His syntax, carefully controlled during their daylight interactions, would slip at night when he became absorbed in argument, revealing speech patterns that belonged to the upper classes, the unconscious markers of breeding and expensive education that no amount of play acting could entirely disguise. She noticed, too, the way the housekeeper Mrs. Whitmore treated him, not with the casual authority she exercised over the other servants, but with a curious deference, almost as if she were in his employ rather than the reverse. And once Georgiana had observed the older woman actually curtsy slightly when speaking to Edmund in the corridor, a gesture so automatic and so utterly inappropriate for addressing a footman that Georgiana had stopped in her tracks, staring until both Edmund and Mrs. Whitmore noticed her presence and the housekeeper hurried away with suspicious speed. Letters arrived for Edmund with unusual frequency, delivered not through the normal household post, but by special messenger, and Georgiana caught glimpses of him receiving these letters with expressions of barely concealed frustration before tucking them away in his coat, unread or perhaps to be read later in whatever private space he occupied in the servant quarters. The mystery consumed her thoughts during the day, distracted her from her usual duties managing the household, made her restless and unable to concentrate on anything except the question of who Edmund truly was and why he persisted in this inexplicable charade. The days became a kind of torture, maintaining the perfect formality of servant and mistress, while knowing what she now knew, while remembering the conversations they had shared just hours before in the intimate darkness of the library. Edmund served her breakfast tea each morning at precisely 8 o'clock, as he had done for 3 years. But now everything about the ritual had changed, charged with new meaning and terrible awareness. She found herself dressing more carefully, even for these early morning encounters, choosing her most becoming morning gowns, arranging her hair with greater attention to appearance, telling herself it meant nothing, while knowing it meant everything. One particular morning in early March, as winter began its reluctant retreat and the first signs of spring appeared in the gardens beyond the breakfast-room windows, Edmund poured her tea with his usual precise movements, and their fingers brushed on the handle of the cup. It was the briefest contact, over in a heartbeat, the kind of accidental touch that occurred 100 times a day in any household, yet Georgiana saw Edmund's eyes close briefly, as if in physical pain, saw his jaw tighten and his hand tremble infinitesimally before he regained control. The moment cut through her with shocking force, the realization that he felt it too, this impossible attraction that built with every midnight conversation, every shared laugh over some obscure philosophical point, every moment when their eyes met across the pages of ancient texts, and she felt seen in ways she had never experienced before. The impossibility of their situation pressed down on her with suffocating weight, the vast distance between her position as dependent relation and his as servant creating a gulf that could never be crossed without scandal and ruin. Yet the very impossibility seemed only to intensify the feelings growing between them, transforming simple intellectual companionship into something far more dangerous and consuming. They began taking risks, small at first, and then increasingly reckless, standing closer than propriety allowed when examining books together in the library, letting conversations drift from safe intellectual topics to more personal territory, sharing confidences about loneliness and loss, and the particular pain of living in a household where one felt perpetually invisible. Edmund told her about his mother, who had died when he was young, a woman of great intelligence and learning, who had believed education was a fundamental right rather than a privilege of birth. And Georgiana heard in his voice a grief that mirrored her own for her father, a shared understanding of what it meant to lose the person who had truly seen and valued you. She told him about the 3 years since her father's death, the slow erosion of her sense of self-worth, the constant reminders that she existed on sufferance and had no real place or purpose, and Edmund listened with an intensity that made her feel her experiences mattered, that her pain was valid rather than the self-indulgent complaints of a woman who should be grateful for any shelter at all. He began leaving books for her, volumes pulled from the shelves and left on the small table beside what had become her chair, always with passages marked in light pencil that he clearly chose specifically for her, pieces of poetry or philosophy or archaeological description that he thought would interest or move or challenge her. It was a silent conversation carried on in the margins of texts, his pencil marks becoming a kind of intimate communication that existed parallel to their spoken words. And Georgiana found herself treasuring these marked passages, returning to them during the day when she could not see him, tracing the faint lines and imagining his hand making those marks, thinking of her. The household around them had erupted into chaos as preparations for Beatrice's wedding accelerated, the event now scheduled for the first week of June, just 10 weeks away, and the frenzy of activity provided useful cover for Georgiana and Edmund's increasingly frequent encounters. Dressmakers came and went, bearing elaborate creations for Beatrice's trousseau, and the dining room became a staging ground for discussions of guest lists and seating arrangements and menu selections that consumed hours of her uncle's attention. The Duke of Wentworth, Beatrice's mysterious betrothed, had still not visited Ashwood Hall, conducting his courtship entirely through letters that arrived with impressive regularity and gifts of increasing extravagance, jewels and silk, and a matched pair of carriage horses that had Beatrice squealing with delight. The absence should have struck everyone as peculiar, Georgiana thought. This duke who was supposedly so enamored of his bride that he could not wait to marry her yet, who apparently could not spare the time to actually meet her in person. But Beatrice seemed unconcerned, too busy displaying her engagement ring and planning her elevation to Duchess to question the oddity of the situation. Georgiana found the whole business strange and rather sad, a marriage arranged between two people who had never spoken face to face, but then the aristocracy specialized in such arrangements, treating matrimony as a business transaction rather than a meeting of hearts and minds. One night in late March, when spring had truly arrived and the gardens beyond the library windows showed early bulbs pushing through the soil, crocuses and snowdrops bringing color back to the grey winter landscape, Georgiana finally confronted Edmund directly about his identity. They had been discussing a particularly complex passage in Marcus Aurelius, debating whether the Stoic emperor's philosophy of acceptance could be reconciled with any meaningful pursuit of personal happiness, when Georgiana set down her book and fixed Edmund with a level stare. "You are not a footman," she said, abandoning any pretense of accepting his cover story. "Everything about you contradicts it. Your education, your bearing, your knowledge of my father's academic work, the way Mrs. Whitmore treats you, the letters that arrive by special messenger. Why do you hide here, Edmund? What are you running from?" Edmund had been sitting in his usual chair across from her, relaxed and absorbed in their conversation, but at her question his entire body tensed, the mask of careful neutrality slamming back into place even as she watched. For a long moment he said nothing, and she could see him weighing how to respond, calculating how much truth he could safely reveal. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and strained, the words clearly costing him effort. "Everyone hides from something, Miss Fairfax. You hide in this library from a world that has diminished you, that has reduced you, from a professor's beloved daughter to a poor relation tolerated on sufferance. I hide in plain sight from a world that would destroy me if it knew the truth." The answer was honest in its evasiveness, acknowledging the question while refusing to truly answer it, and Georgiana felt frustration rising sharp and hot in her chest. 3 years, Edmund. 3 years you have been invisible to me, serving my tea every morning, moving through this house like a ghost, and now I can see nothing else. I think about you constantly. I find myself watching for you during the day, counting the hours until I can come here at night and speak with you as an equal. You have become the center of my existence, and yet I do not even know who you really are. The confession hung between them, more raw and vulnerable than she had intended, laying bare the depth of her feelings in a way that could not be retracted or softened. Edmund's face transformed with anguish, and she saw him fighting some internal battle, duty warring with desire, obligation struggling against honest emotion. "I cannot tell you," he said finally, and his voice broke slightly on the words. "Not yet. The revelation would hurt more people than just myself. There are obligations, commitments I made long ago that I cannot simply abandon, no matter how much I might wish to." The vagueness of his answer terrified her, suggesting complications she could not even imagine, and her mind immediately leapt to the worst possibility. "Are you married?" she asked, and heard the fear in her own voice, the desperate need to know if this impossible attachment was also an immoral one. Edmund's head snapped up, his eyes meeting hers with fierce intensity. "No," he said emphatically. "I swear to you on everything I hold sacred, there is no wife, no attachment of that nature. I am not betraying another woman by spending these nights with you. But there is an obligation, a commitment made when I was very young to someone I did not choose, an arrangement that binds me regardless of my personal wishes or feelings. I am trapped, Georgiana, as surely as if I were locked in chains, and I cannot break free without destroying others who depend on me, without violating oaths I cannot in good conscience abandon." The use of her Christian name, the first time he had spoken it aloud, sent a shock through her system, marking a line crossed from which there could be no retreat. She leaned forward in her chair, close enough now to see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, close enough to catch the scent of sandalwood and book leather that she had come to associate with these midnight hours. "Then let me help you," she said softly. "Whatever this obligation is, whatever binds you, perhaps together we could find a solution. You do not have to carry this burden alone." Edmund reached out as if to touch her face, his hand rising and then falling back to his side as he remembered himself. Remembered the impossibility of any physical contact between them. "You are generous beyond measure," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But this is not a problem that can be solved through cleverness or determination. It is woven into the fabric of who I am, what I am, and to cut those threads would unravel everything. All I can offer you is these nights, these conversations, this small corner of time where we can be ourselves without the weight of obligation and expectation. It is not enough, I know that, but it is all I have to give. The spring continued its advance, transforming the grounds of Ashwood Hall from winter barrenness to tentative green. And Georgiana and Edmund continued their pattern of midnight meetings, each conversation deepening the connection between them, while the mystery of his true identity remained frustratingly opaque. She began to catalogue the clues obsessively, lying awake during the hours when sleep would not come, trying to piece together a coherent picture from the fragments she had gathered. He was clearly aristocracy. That much seemed certain, probably titled given the deference Mrs. Whitmore showed him, but what circumstances could drive a nobleman to serve as a footman in another man's household? Was he in hiding from creditors, from scandal, from some crime that would see him imprisoned, or worse if discovered? The obligation he spoke of suggested an arranged marriage, perhaps, some dynastic alliance contracted in his youth that he sought to escape. But if so, why not simply break the engagement and face the social consequences rather than living this bizarre double existence? Nothing made sense. And yet the evidence was undeniable. Edmund was not what he appeared, had never been what he appeared. And with each passing night, Georgiana felt herself falling deeper into impossible love with a man whose real name she might not even know. Their daytime encounters became almost unbearable, the formal servant-mistress interactions a torture of suppressed feeling and careful distance. She would sit at breakfast while Edmund poured her tea, his face a perfect mask of professional neutrality, and want to scream at the unfairness of it all, the cruel joke of finding intellectual and emotional connection with someone permanently separated from her by the rigid hierarchies of English society. Even if he were revealed to be a gentleman fallen on hard times, even if his mysterious past proved less scandalous than she feared, the fact remained that she was a dependent relation with no fortune or prospects, and he was a servant, and any attachment between them would bring nothing but scandal and ruin to them both. Yet despite knowing this, despite understanding the absolute impossibility of any future together, Georgiana could not bring herself to stop seeking him out each night, could not give up the only true happiness she had known since her father's death. In early April, as Beatrice received yet another extravagant gift from her absent duke, an emerald necklace that must have cost several £1,000, Georgiana stood in the drawing-room watching her cousin preen and parade her good fortune, and felt a hollow despair settle in her chest. This was what the world valued, she thought bitterly. Jewels and titles and advantageous matches, not meeting of minds or genuine understanding, not the kind of intellectual and emotional partnership she had found with Edmund in their midnight library. Beatrice would become a duchess without ever having a real conversation with her husband, would live in luxury and status, while Georgiana, who had found something infinitely more precious, would lose it all when Edmund's mysterious obligation finally forced him to leave, when whatever circumstances had brought him to Ashwood Hall resolved themselves and he vanished from her life as suddenly as he had entered it 3 years ago, before she had even known enough to notice or care. The announcement came at breakfast on a Wednesday in late May, delivered by Lord Ashwood, with the barely contained excitement of a man who had waited years for this moment to arrive. The Duke of Wentworth would be arriving at Ashwood Hall in 3 days' time, finally coming to claim his bride, and the wedding would proceed as planned in a fortnight, with all the grandeur befitting the union of 2 of England's greatest families. The household erupted into frenzied preparation, servants running in all directions, tradesmen summoned to make last-minute improvements to guest chambers, cook conferring urgently with Lord Ashwood about menus suitable for entertaining a duke of such consequence and wealth. Beatrice floated through the chaos in a state of rapturous anticipation, ordering new gowns and practicing her curtsy, and boring anyone who would listen with endless speculation about what her future husband would be like, whether he would be tall or short, dark or fair, handsome or merely distinguished, as if these superficial details mattered more than the character of the man she was binding herself to for life. Georgiana moved through the preparations in a fog of misery, helping to organize the chaos, while her mind remained fixed on the library, on Edmund, on the impossibility of maintaining their midnight meetings once the Duke arrived and filled the house with his presence and entourage. She had not seen Edmund since the announcement, had noticed his absence from breakfast service with a growing sense of alarm that intensified when she made discreet inquiries, and learned he had been confined to the servants' quarters with some vague illness, a convenient fiction that fooled no one, but which provided plausible explanation for his sudden disappearance from household duties. She knew with absolute certainty that his absence had nothing to do with illness and everything to do with the Duke's impending arrival, that somehow Edmund's mysterious obligation was connected to this event. But the nature of that connection eluded her, even as dread settled like lead in her stomach. 2 days passed without any sight of him. 2 days during which she went to the library each night and found it empty, the chairs where they had sat cold and unused, the books unmarked by his familiar pencil notations. The absence felt like a death, a severing of connection that left her hollow and desperate. And on the 3rd night, with the Duke expected to arrive the following afternoon, Georgiana did something she had never imagined herself capable of doing. She ventured into the servants' wing of Ashwood Hall, a territory as foreign to her as the far side of the moon, driven by a need to see Edmund that overrode every consideration of propriety and sense. The servants' quarters occupied the east wing of the house, accessed through a warren of narrow corridors and back staircases that Georgiana had never explored, and she felt like a trespasser as she made her way through passages lit only by the single candle she carried, her heart hammering with equal parts fear of discovery and determination to find answers. She had bribed a housemaid earlier that day, trading a pair of her mother's pearl earrings for information about which room Edmund occupied, and now she counted doors in the dim corridor until she reached the one the girl had described, 3rd from the end on the left, distinguished by a small brass number plate that read 7. She raised her hand to knock, then hesitated, suddenly aware of the enormity of what she was doing, the scandal that would erupt if anyone discovered her here. But before she could retreat, Edmund's door opened, and she found herself face to face with Mrs. Whitmore, the housekeeper, who emerged carrying a dinner tray. The older woman's eyes widened in shock, then narrowed in something that might have been understanding or pity, and she gave that strange little curtsy Georgiana had noticed before, as if addressing someone of higher rank rather than a dependent relation, caught somewhere she absolutely should not be. "He is within, Miss Fairfax," Mrs. Whitmore said quietly, her voice carrying none of the censure Georgiana expected. Perhaps it is time certain truths were finally spoken aloud. She moved past Georgiana and disappeared down the corridor, leaving the door to Edmund's room standing open like an invitation or a trap. Georgiana stood frozen for a long moment, aware that stepping through that threshold would change everything, that some boundaries once crossed could never be recrossed. But the need to see him, to understand what was happening, proved stronger than caution. She entered the room and immediately understood that something was profoundly wrong with the picture Edmund had painted of himself as a simple footman making his way in the world. The chamber was far too fine for servants' quarters, furnished not with the rough wooden pieces appropriate to his supposed station, but with elegant mahogany furniture, a proper bed with silk hangings, rather than the narrow cot most footmen would occupy, a writing desk of obvious quality positioned near the window. Books lined one wall, volumes that she recognized from the library downstairs, and others that must be Edmund's personal collection, works of philosophy and history and classical literature that would cost more than a footman earned in years. A wardrobe stood open, revealing not just the blue and silver Ashwood livery, but also gentlemen's clothing of obvious expense and quality, coats of superfine wool and silk waistcoats and linen shirts, so fine they must have come from the most exclusive tailors in London. But it was the writing desk that drew her attention, pulled her across the room with the inevitability of gravity, because on its surface lay a half-written letter, the ink still wet, and even from a distance she could see the signature that stopped her heart. The letter was addressed to a firm of solicitors in London, discussing arrangements for a wedding settlement, and it was signed in a bold, decisive hand. Edmund Wentworth, Duke of Wentworth. The words swam before her eyes as her mind struggled to process what they meant, to reconcile the impossible information they conveyed with everything she thought she knew. Edmund was the Duke, had been the Duke all along, was the very man betrothed to her cousin Beatrice, the absent bridegroom who had conducted his courtship through letters and gifts while living as a servant in his future father-in-law's household. The revelation crashed over her like a wave, drowning her in implications and betrayals, and she reached for the desk to steady herself as the room tilted and spun. Every moment of the past 6 weeks recontextualized itself in her mind. Every conversation in the library transformed from intellectual connection between equals into something far more sinister, a duke playing at being a servant while secretly studying the family he would join through marriage, while all the time his true intended was Beatrice, beautiful golden Beatrice, who would become his duchess while Georgiana remained the invisible poor relation she had always been. She had been such a fool, had let herself believe that someone saw her, valued her, when in reality Edmund had come to Ashwood for Beatrice just like every other man of consequence, had looked past Georgiana to her prettier, wealthier, more suitable cousin exactly as the rest of the world did. The pain was so intense it felt physical, a crushing weight on her chest that made breathing difficult, and she was still standing there holding the damning letter when she heard footsteps behind her and Edmund's voice, rough with shock and something that might have been despair. Georgiana. She turned to face him. This man she thought she knew, this stranger wearing Edmund's face, and saw him framed in the doorway, still dressed in his footman's livery, his expression transformed by anguish and what looked like genuine fear. He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him, an automatic gesture toward privacy that under any other circumstances would have been ruinously improper, but which now seemed merely absurd given the magnitude of deception already accomplished. "You are the Duke," she said, and was distantly proud that her voice remained steady, even as her hands shook, making the letter tremble in her grip. "You have been him all along. Every tea service, every polite yes, Miss Fairfax, every moment in the library discussing philosophy and my father's work, all of it a lie." Edmund flinched as if she had struck him, his face draining of colour, but he made no attempt to deny the accusation. "Not the library," he said urgently, moving toward her with one hand outstretched as if to touch her, to comfort her, before apparently thinking better of it and letting his arm fall to his side. "Never those nights, Georgiana. That was the only truth in 3 years of deception, the only time I could be myself, be honest about what I thought and felt and valued. Everything else was performance, yes, but not those conversations with you." The use of her first name barely registered through the roaring in her ears, through the crushing weight of betrayal and humiliation. "You are betrothed to Beatrice," she said, and heard her voice rise despite her attempts at control. "You have been living here, watching your future bride, sending her love letters and expensive gifts while sitting in the library with me every night pretending to be a footman who reads Greek. Did you laugh at me? Did you find it amusing? the poor relation so desperate for attention that she did not question why a servant possessed a gentleman's education. Tears were streaming down her face now, hot and unbidden, and she saw answering moisture in Edmund's eyes, saw him struggling with emotion that looked genuine, even though she could no longer trust anything about him. "I never laughed at you," he said, his voice breaking. "I never found any of this amusing." "Georgiana, please let me explain. I inherited the dukedom at 19, just a boy, when my father died suddenly. With his last breath he made me swear to honor the betrothal he had arranged when I was 7 years old, a contract joining the Wentworth estates with the Fairfax properties through marriage to Beatrice, who was then just 12. I was appalled, sickened by the idea of being bound to a child I did not know based on negotiations about land and money, but I had given my dying father my word, and I could not simply abandon the commitment. So I did what seemed at the time like the logical thing. I came here to observe the family I was contracted to join, to understand who Beatrice was before I bound myself to her for life. I assumed a false identity, took a position as footman through connections my mother's family had with the household, intending to stay a few months and then reveal myself, and proceed with the marriage. But months became years, and I kept finding reasons to delay, to postpone, to put off the moment when I would have to claim my true identity and fulfill my obligation. The explanation poured out of him in a rush, words tumbling over each other, as if he had been waiting years to speak them aloud, and Georgiana listened with a kind of numb horror, understanding dawning like a slow and terrible sunrise. "You came here for Beatrice," she said flatly. "You came to study your future bride, to determine if you could tolerate spending your life with her, and instead you found me in the library and what? Decided I would make a pleasant diversion while you waited to marry my cousin? Is that what the past 6 weeks have been? Entertainment for a bored duke playing at being a servant?" Edmund moved then, crossing the space between them in 2 long strides, and before she could retreat, he had grasped her shoulders, not roughly, but with desperate intensity, his face inches from hers, his eyes blazing with emotion that could not possibly be feigned. "I never intended this," he said, and his voice was raw with anguish. "I came to observe a family arrangement, to see if I could endure a marriage to a woman chosen for me in childhood, and for the first 2 years I barely noticed you. You were invisible to me, just as you said you were invisible to everyone else, the quiet cousin who managed the household and kept to herself. But then something changed. I cannot even tell you when it happened, but I began to see you. I saw how you handled your uncle's casual cruelties with dignity, how you planned his dinners and received no credit, how you would slip away to the library late at night, seeking refuge in books because you had nowhere else to go. I saw your loneliness because it mirrored my own, and I started going to the library hoping I might encounter you there, hoping for the chance to speak with someone who understood what it meant to be trapped in an impossible situation. And when we finally did speak that first night, when I saw your face light up discussing Aristotle and your father's work, I was lost. I fell in love with you, Georgiana, brilliant and kind and invisible to everyone but me. I saw you, truly saw you, and in seeing you I finally saw myself clearly too, saw what my life had become, what I had sacrificed in service to obligation and duty. The confession should have moved her, should have softened the betrayal, but instead it only made the pain sharper, more acute. "You saw me," she said, and the bitterness in her voice surprised them both. "Then why did you not trust me with the truth? Why let me fall in love with a footman who does not exist? Why take those nights in the library, those conversations, those moments when I felt truly known for the first time in 3 years, and build them all on lies?" Edmund's hands fell from her shoulders, and he stepped back, his face crumpling with grief and self-recrimination. "Because Edmund the footman could love you freely," he said quietly. "The Duke of Wentworth cannot. He belongs to your cousin by law and honour, by contracts signed and oaths given to a dying father. I chose the servant's livery because only in servitude was I free to be myself without the weight of title and obligation, free to love whom I chose rather than whom I was commanded to love. It was cowardice, I know that, and it was selfish beyond measure. I told myself I was stealing just a little more time before I would have to face my duty, before I would have to give you up and marry Beatrice as I swore I would. But the time kept extending, and I could not bring myself to end it, could not bear to lose the only genuine happiness I have known in my adult life." The room fell silent except for the sound of their ragged breathing, the weight of 3 years of deception settling between them like a physical presence. Outside the small window, Georgiana could hear the sounds of the household still awake and working, preparing for the Duke's arrival tomorrow, preparing for the wedding that would bind Edmund to Beatrice and relegate Georgiana permanently to her role as invisible relation. "You were never free," she said finally, her voice hollow and exhausted. "And neither was I. We were both hiding in that library from lives we cannot escape, building something beautiful and impossible out of stolen hours and forbidden conversations. But at least my cage is honest. I know exactly what I am and what the world expects of me. You have been living a lie, Edmund, pretending to be something you are not, and in doing so, you have made liars of both of us." She moved toward the door, needing to escape this room with its evidence of wealth and deception, needing to get away from him before her resolution crumbled entirely. But Edmund blocked her path, not touching her, but standing close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "Please," he said, and the word came out broken, pleading. "Please do not leave like this. I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but I am begging you to let me try to make this right. I will break the betrothal, consequences be damned. I will find a way out of the contracts, pay whatever penalty is required. I cannot marry Beatrice now, cannot stand beside her knowing that I love you, that you are the one I want to spend my life with." Georgiana looked up at him and felt her heart break cleanly in two, one half still desperately in love with this man despite everything, the other half consumed by betrayal and the crushing realization that she had been invisible even to Edmund initially, that he had looked past her to Beatrice, just like everyone else, until loneliness and proximity had made him see what had always been there. "You cannot break the betrothal," she said quietly. "You gave your dying father your word, and you are a man of honor however much you might wish otherwise. Breaking that oath would destroy you, would make you into someone you could not live with, and I will not be the cause of that. Moreover, breaking the engagement at this point would humiliate Beatrice, publicly, would make her an object of scandal and pity, and whatever else she may be, she does not deserve that." She paused, gathering the courage for what she had to say next, the words that would end this impossible dream before it destroyed them both. "I never want to see you again, Edmund," she said, and watched him recoil as if she had slapped him. "When you arrive tomorrow as the Duke, when you claim your bride and proceed with your wedding, I will not be here. I will take a position as a governess or companion, will accept the first offer that comes, anything to remove myself from this household before I have to watch you marry my cousin while knowing what we shared in that library, what we could have been if circumstances were different. The thought of you serving tea to Beatrice at breakfast, of you sharing her bed and her life while remembering our conversations, is more than I can bear. So I am choosing to leave, to make myself truly invisible by removing myself entirely from your world." Edmund's face had gone ashen, his eyes bright with unshed tears, and when he spoke his voice was barely audible. "I love you, Georgiana Fairfax. I know I have no right to say it. Know that I have forfeited any claim to your affection through my deception, but I need you to know it is true. You are the finest person I have ever known, brilliant and kind and genuine in ways I had forgotten were possible in my world of obligation and performance. If I could choose freely, if I were truly free as I pretended to be in that library, I would choose you without hesitation. I would choose you over duty, over honor, over everything." The declaration hung in the air between them, beautiful and terrible and completely useless, because they both knew that in the world they inhabited, love was not enough to overcome the barriers of obligation and station that separated them. Georgiana felt tears sliding down her face, hot and bitter, mourning not just for what they had lost, but for what they had never truly had, built as it was on foundations of lies and impossible circumstances. "Goodbye, Edmund," she whispered, and this time when she moved toward the door he did not try to stop her. She fled down the corridor and back through the warren of passages to the main house, her candle extinguished and forgotten, navigating by memory and desperate need to escape. Behind her she heard no pursuit, no calls for her to return, only the terrible silence of a dream dying. And when she finally reached her own small chamber, she collapsed on the bed and wept as she had not wept since her father's death. Great wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. She cried for the loss of Edmund, for the betrayal of trust, for the 3 years she had been invisible while he studied her family and prepared to marry her cousin, for the 6 weeks of perfect connection that had been built on deception and could never be recovered. Most of all, she cried for the cruel joke of finally being seen, truly known and valued, only to discover that the man who saw her belonged to someone else by bonds that could not be broken, that the library sanctuary where they had been equals existed outside the real world and could not withstand the harsh light of truth and obligation that now flooded in to drown it. 3 days passed in a blur of misery and desperate planning, Georgiana making inquiries about positions as governess or companion, while avoiding any part of the house where she might encounter Edmund, staying in her chamber except when absolutely necessary, and taking her meals on a tray rather than face the dining room where he might appear to serve. She had written to 3 families of her acquaintance seeking employment, humiliating letters in which she offered her services, teaching young ladies the accomplishments expected of their station, and she waited for responses that would provide her escape from Ashwood Hall before the wedding, that would bind Edmund to Beatrice and trap Georgiana in a household where every breakfast would be torture, every glimpse of the Duke and his new Duchess a knife twisting in her chest. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, the day the Duke of Wentworth was finally expected to arrive and claim his bride, Georgiana stood at her chamber window, watching the drive with a kind of sick fascination, unable to look away, even though every moment of the spectacle felt like a fresh wound. The household had assembled in the entrance hall in full ceremonial array, Lord Ashwood in his finest coat, Beatrice resplendent in a gown of pale blue silk that must have cost a fortune, servants lined up in perfect rows to greet the master, who would soon be family. Georgiana had pleaded illness to avoid participating in the welcome, claiming a headache that was not entirely feigned, and from her vantage point 3 floors above the scene, she watched the Duke's carriage appear at the end of the long tree-lined drive, a magnificent equipage pulled by 4 matched greys, the Wentworth coat of arms emblazoned on the door in gilt and azure. The carriage rolled to a stop before the entrance, and Footman rushed to open the door, and Georgiana held her breath, dreading and desperate in equal measure to finally see Edmund as himself, to witness the transformation from servant to Duke that would make their impossible situation horrifyingly real. But the man who emerged from the carriage was not Edmund. He was tall and fair-haired, where Edmund was dark, broader in the shoulders and perhaps a few years older, dressed in the height of fashion with an elegance that spoke of wealth and breeding. Georgiana's mind struggled to process what she was seeing, confused and disoriented, until the stranger turned his face toward the window where she stood, and she caught a glimpse of his expression, the barely suppressed amusement of someone playing a role he found entertaining, and understanding crashed over her with dizzying force. This was not the Duke, or rather, he was playing the Duke, standing in for Edmund in some elaborate charade whose purpose she could not yet fathom. Lord Ashwood rushed forward with effusive greetings. Beatrice curtsied with practised grace, and the false Duke accepted their welcome with the easy authority of someone accustomed to deference, allowing himself to be escorted into the house, while servants scurried to unload luggage from the second carriage that had pulled up behind the first. Georgiana stood frozen at her window, her mind racing through possibilities, until a knock at her chamber door made her jump. She opened it to find one of the housemaids, a young girl named Mary, holding a sealed note. "For you, miss," the girl said, her eyes wide with curiosity and something that might have been conspiracy. From one of the footmen, he said it was urgent. She took the note with trembling hands and waited until Mary had departed before breaking the seal. Inside, in Edmund's familiar hand, was a single sentence that made her heart lurch painfully in her chest. "Trust me, please. Come to dinner tonight. You will understand everything." She should burn the note, should refuse to participate in whatever scheme Edmund had concocted, should maintain the distance she had sworn to keep between them. But curiosity warred with caution, and beneath both emotions ran a current of desperate hope she could not quite extinguish, the treacherous wondering if perhaps Edmund had found a way out of the impossible situation that bound them both. When the dinner bell rang that evening, Georgiana descended to the dining room in the best gown she possessed, a dress of deep green silk that had belonged to her mother and which she had altered to fit her own smaller frame, wearing the only jewelry she still owned, her mother's small pearl earrings and a simple gold chain. She looked presentable, if not fashionable, certainly nothing compared to Beatrice's splendor, but something in her refused to appear before this false Duke looking like the poor relation she was, refused to give Beatrice the satisfaction of outshining her completely on this night of all nights. The dining room blazed with what must have been 200 candles, the crystal chandeliers ablaze, every piece of silver polished to mirror brightness, the table set with the finest china and linens that Ashwood Hall possessed. Beatrice held court at the centre of attention, positioned beside the false Duke, who introduced himself as the Duke of Wentworth with such conviction that Georgiana almost doubted her own eyes, almost believed she had imagined seeing Edmund emerge from that carriage. But then she noticed Edmund himself, standing in his usual position by the sideboard in full footman's livery, his face carefully neutral, and the audacity of the deception took her breath away. How did Edmund dare this charade, this elaborate performance with a substitute duke while he continued to play the servant, and what could he possibly hope to accomplish except to delay the inevitable moment when truth would emerge and destroy them all? Lord Ashwood fawned over the false Duke with embarrassing obsequiousness, praising the Wentworth estates and bloodline, calculating aloud the advantages of the connection, while Beatrice simpered and preened, clearly delighted with her handsome Duke, who looked exactly as a Duke should look, tall and fair and elegant, nothing like the dark intensity of Edmund serving wine around the table with silent efficiency. Georgiana took her usual seat near the draughty window, expecting to be ignored as always, but to her shock, the false Duke turned his attention to her almost immediately. His eyes, which she now noticed were a startling shade of blue, fixed on her with what appeared to be genuine interest. "Miss Georgiana," he said, his voice cultured and pleasant, "I understand your father was the renowned Professor Edmund Fairfax. His work on Athenian pottery revolutionized the field, combining archaeological evidence with textual analysis in ways that changed how we understand ancient domestic life. Have you inherited his scholarly passions? The question hit Georgiana like a physical blow, the specificity of it, the casual mention of details no one should know unless they had studied her father's work closely or discussed it extensively with someone who had. She glanced at Edmund and caught him watching her with an intensity that belied his servant's pose, and she understood with sudden clarity that every word coming from the false duke's mouth had been coached by Edmund, that this entire performance was designed to demonstrate something, though to what end she could not yet determine. Before she could formulate a response, Beatrice interrupted with a laugh like breaking glass. "Georgiana merely plays at learning, Your Grace. A proper lady's education is sufficient for her station. She reads a bit of Greek and imagines herself a scholar, but it is nothing more than affectation, I assure you." The casual cruelty was vintage Beatrice, the kind of dismissive comment Georgiana had endured for 3 years. But this time the false duke did not smile or nod in agreement, as most men would have done. Instead, his expression cooled noticeably, and when he spoke his voice carried an edge that made Beatrice's smile falter. "How curious," he said quietly. "I find that true nobility of mind far exceeds nobility of birth, Miss Beatrice. Some of the greatest intellects I have known possessed no titles or fortunes, while many who bear the finest names have minds as shallow as puddles." He turned back to Georgiana with warmth that felt genuine despite knowing it was all performance. "Miss Georgiana, perhaps you would show me your father's library tomorrow. I am told it contains treasures, and I would very much like to discuss his methodologies with someone who understands his work intimately." The silence that fell over the table was thick with shock and confusion, Lord Ashwood looking bewildered, Beatrice's face flushing with humiliation and anger, and Georgiana herself caught between the desire to laugh at the beautiful reversal and the fear of where this charade was leading. She forced herself to respond calmly, to play her part in whatever game Edmund had orchestrated. "I would be honored, Your Grace. My father's library was his greatest pride, and it would please me to share it with someone who appreciates his contributions to classical scholarship." The dinner proceeded in increasing awkwardness, the false duke continuing to direct his conversation primarily to Georgiana, asking about her education, her knowledge of ancient languages, her thoughts on recent archaeological discoveries, all topics that Edmund had learned she cared about during their midnight conversations in the library. Beatrice grew increasingly petulant, trying repeatedly to redirect the duke's attention to herself, complaining about the wedding preparations, displaying her ring, describing the renovations she planned to make to Wentworth Abbey once she became its mistress. But the false duke received all her attempts with polite disinterest, his attention returning always to Georgiana, creating a dynamic that inverted the usual hierarchy so completely that even the servants began to notice, whispers passing between them as they served each course. Edmund moved through it all like a ghost, pouring wine and removing plates with his usual efficiency. But Georgiana could feel his attention on her, could sense him watching for her reactions, gauging whether she understood what he was trying to demonstrate. By the time the final course was cleared and port was being served to the gentlemen, the tension at the table had reached a breaking point. Beatrice's face twisted with fury and confusion, Lord Ashwood's bonhomie strained by his daughter's obvious failure to captivate her intended husband. It was then that the false duke rose from his seat, commanding immediate attention with the natural authority of his bearing, and delivered the blow that shattered Beatrice's world as completely as Georgiana's had been shattered 3 nights earlier. "Lord Ashwood," he said formally, his voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent dining room, "I must inform you of an irregularity that my solicitors have discovered in the betrothal contract between myself and your daughter. Upon close examination, It appears the agreement contains a provision that I had not previously understood, one that makes it impossible for me to proceed with the marriage as planned." Lord Ashwood surged to his feet, his face reddening with alarm. "Your Grace, surely any irregularity can be resolved. My daughter has prepared for this marriage for months. The invitations have been sent, the arrangements made. What possible provision could prevent the wedding from proceeding?" The false duke looked at Beatrice with something that might have been pity, then turned his gaze to Georgiana, and in that moment she saw him clearly for the first time, saw past the performance to the man beneath, someone capable of great loyalty and equally great courage in service to his friend. "The irregularity is one of the heart, Lord Ashwood. The contract my father signed specified a union between the Duke of Wentworth and a daughter of the Fairfax family, but it did not specify which daughter. And I find that I cannot in good conscience marry where there is no meeting of minds, no true compatibility of spirit and intellect. Your daughter Beatrice is undoubtedly beautiful and accomplished in all the ways society values, but she is not the Fairfax daughter I choose. The contract, therefore, is void, as I cannot be compelled to marry against the fundamental principle of mutual respect and intellectual partnership." The words fell like stones into still water, their impact spreading in waves of shock and scandal. Beatrice made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob, her face draining of colour, and Lord Ashwood sputtered incoherent protests while the assembled servants stood frozen in various attitudes of disbelief. Georgiana felt the room spin around her, understanding flooding in with dizzying force. Edmund had found a loophole in the contract, had discovered or perhaps invented a technicality that allowed him to break the betrothal without violating his oath to his dying father, and now his friend, this false duke who must be Lord Nathaniel Brandon based on Edmund's occasional mentions of his cousin, was delivering the rejection publicly to ensure there could be no quiet reversal, no pressure brought to force the original arrangement back into place. In the chaos that erupted, servants rushing forward to assist the swooning Beatrice, Lord Ashwood alternating between rage and desperate pleading, Georgiana's eyes found Edmund across the room and saw him watching her with an expression of naked hope and terrible vulnerability. The question in his gaze was clear even without words. "Can you forgive me? Will you trust me? Will you give me the chance to make this right?" She could not answer, could not process the enormity of what had just occurred. And so she did what she always did when the world became too much to bear. She fled to the library, hearing the sounds of pandemonium fading behind her as she ran through the familiar corridors to the one place that had always offered sanctuary. The library was dark, and she did not bother with candles, simply sank into her usual chair and tried to breathe through the overwhelming chaos of emotions churning in her chest. Edmund had done this for her, had orchestrated an elaborate deception to break his betrothal to Beatrice, had humiliated her cousin publicly in a reversal of all the small cruelties Beatrice had inflicted over the years. It was too much, too grand a gesture, too dramatic and risky and potentially ruinous for them all. She heard the door open and close, heard footsteps crossing the floor, and then Edmund was there, kneeling before her chair still dressed in his footman's livery, and the symbolism of it struck her with the force of revelation. The Duke kneeling before the poor relation, the master seeking permission from the one who had been invisible. "I have nothing to offer you but the truth, finally," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I am Edmund Wentworth, Duke of Wentworth, and for 3 years I served you tea because it was the only way I could be near you without the weight of expectation, without the burden of title and obligation that comes with my position. I know I deceived you, know that I built our connection on a foundation of lies, but I need you to understand that the man you met in this library every night was the truest version of myself I have ever been. You deceived me," Georgiana said, and her voice broke on the words. You let me love a man who did not exist. Let me believe Edmund the footman was real when all along he was just a role you were playing." Edmund reached for her hands and she let him take them, let him hold them in his own as he looked up at her with eyes that gleamed with tears in the faint light from the windows. "He did exist," he said fiercely. "The man in this library every night, the one who discussed philosophy with you and marked passages in your father's books and fell more deeply in love with you with every conversation, that man was real. He was more real than the Duke of Wentworth has ever been, more honest than any version of myself I show to the world of society and obligation. The Duke is the disguise, Georgiana. Edmund is who I am with you, stripped of pretense and performance, just a man who found in you everything he had been seeking without knowing he was seeking it." The words should have moved her, should have melted the anger and hurt, but she found herself clinging to her pain as a kind of protection against the vulnerability of hope. "Why should I believe you? Why should I trust anything you say after 3 years of deception?" Edmund's hands tightened on hers, his thumbs moving in small circles against her palms, a gesture of comfort and connection. "Because I am offering you what no one else ever has, what no one else in your life has thought to offer. I am offering you a choice. Refuse me, and I will honor it absolutely. I will release the betrothal to Beatrice as well, and disappear from your life. Let you take that position as governess, and build a new existence free of me and the pain I have caused. I will respect your decision and never trouble you again. But if you can find it in yourself to forgive me, if you can trust me one more time despite all the reasons I have given you not to, then accept me, and I promise you will never be invisible again. You will be my Duchess, yes, but more importantly my partner, my equal in all the ways that matter. We will finish your father's work together, publish his final manuscripts with your name alongside his. We will build a life of meaning, not merely position, of genuine connection, not social performance. I will see you, Georgiana, every day for the rest of our lives, truly see you and value you and choose you, not because obligation binds me, but because my heart demands it." Georgiana felt tears sliding down her face, the careful control she had maintained shattering under the weight of his words, the offer of everything she had never dared hope for. But there were still questions, still pieces that did not quite fit together in her understanding. The man at dinner tonight, the one pretending to be you, who was he? Edmund's mouth quirked in a small smile, the first she had seen since the night in his room when her world had shattered. That was Nathaniel Brandon, my cousin and closest friend, the only person who knew the truth of where I had been these 3 years. He has been covering for me, managing my estates and social obligations, writing the letters to Beatrice that I could not bring myself to write. When I told him I had fallen in love with you, when I explained the impossible situation I had created, he agreed immediately to help me find a way out. The loophole in the contract about which Fairfax's daughter was not actually in the original agreement, we invented it together, knowing that the scandal of the Duke rejecting his betrothed publicly would be severe enough that your uncle would not dare challenge it legally for fear of making the humiliation even worse. It was ruthless and it was cruel to Beatrice, but I could see no other way to free myself from the obligation while still honoring the spirit of my promise to my father. The confession of conspiracy should have troubled her more than it did, but Georgiana found she could not summon much sympathy for Beatrice, who had spent years making Georgiana feel small and worthless, and who now would understand what it felt like to be rejected, to be found wanting, to have her value questioned publicly. It was not kind to feel satisfaction in her cousin's humiliation, but Georgiana was discovering that 3 years of invisible servitude had left her with less charity toward her tormentors than she might have hoped. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "If I accept you, if I agree to this impossible proposal, what becomes of Beatrice and my uncle? What becomes of us?" Edmund shifted his position, moving closer, his hands still holding hers as if afraid she might disappear if he let go. "Beatrice will recover," he said with more confidence than Georgiana felt. "She is young and beautiful, and her portion is substantial. She will find another husband, perhaps one better suited to her temperament than a duke who values scholarship over social position. Your uncle will bluster and threaten, but ultimately accept the situation because he has no choice, and because having a niece who is a duchess, even if she was not his preferred niece, still grants him social advantage. As for us, we will marry quickly and quietly, no grand ceremony to rival what was planned for Beatrice, just a simple service that joins us legally and allows us to begin building the life I described. We will face scandal, certainly. Society will gossip about the duke who rejected his beautiful betrothed for her poor relation, but we will face it together, and in time other scandals will eclipse ours, and we will be left in peace to pursue the work that matters to us." He paused, his eyes searching her face in the dim light. "But none of that matters if you cannot forgive me, Georgiana. I kneel before you not as a duke demanding obedience, but as a man begging for grace. I love you with everything I am, and I am asking you to take a chance on us, to trust that what we built in this library over 6 weeks of midnight conversations was real and strong enough to survive the revelation of my deception." Spring rain had begun to fall outside the tall windows, a soft percussion that seemed to wash away the remnants of winter, and Georgiana looked at Edmund kneeling before her in his footman's livery and saw him clearly for the first time, not the servant, and not the duke, but simply the man, flawed and frightened, and offering her his heart with a vulnerability that must terrify him. She thought of her father, who had always told her that true partnership required intellectual equality and mutual respect, that the greatest marriages were those between minds as much as bodies. She thought of the 6 weeks of conversations, of marked passages in books and debates about philosophy, of feeling truly known for the first time since her father's death. And she thought of the alternative, of refusing him and taking a position as governess, of spending her life teaching other people's children while burying her own intellect and passion in service to strangers. The choice crystallized with sudden clarity, not between forgiveness and anger, not between trust and caution, but between fear and courage, between clinging to the safety of invisibility and risking everything for the possibility of being truly seen. She reached out and touched Edmund's face, letting her fingers trace the line of his jaw, the curve of his cheek, learning the geography of this man who had served her tea for 3 years while secretly loving her. "Yes," she said simply, and watched his expression transform with joy and relief and something very like wonder. "Yes, I will marry you, Edmund Wentworth. I will take the risk and trust you and build this impossible life together. But know this, if you ever serve me tea again as a footman, I shall throw it in your face, because I want you as my partner and my equal, not my servant pretending humility he does not feel." Edmund laughed then, a sound of pure happiness, and rose from his knees to pull her into his arms, holding her with a fierceness that spoke of how much he had feared she would refuse. They married 3 weeks later in the small chapel on the Wentworth estates in Northumberland, a ceremony attended by only a handful of witnesses, including Nathaniel Brandon, who had played his part so brilliantly, and Mrs. Whitmore, who had kept Edmund's secret for 3 years, with a loyalty that spoke of deep affection and respect. Georgiana wore a simple gown of ivory silk, no veil or elaborate trappings, and carried a small bouquet of wildflowers picked from the estate gardens that morning. Edmund stood waiting for her at the altar, no longer in Footman's livery, but dressed as himself, finally, as the Duke of Wentworth. Yet when she looked at him, she saw only Edmund, the man who had knelt before her in the library and offered her partnership instead of possession, freedom instead of constraint. The ceremony was brief and deeply felt, the words of the service taking on weight and meaning as they spoke their vows, promising to honor and cherish, to build a life together based on mutual respect and genuine love rather than social obligation or dynastic necessity. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, when Edmund kissed her for the first time, as her husband, Georgiana felt something fundamental shift inside her, the realization that she was no longer invisible, no longer the poor relation tolerated on sufferance, but rather the Duchess of Wentworth, with all the power and position that title conveyed. Yet more importantly, she was Edmund's chosen partner, his equal in the ways that truly mattered. The scandal had been every bit as severe as Edmund predicted, society buzzing with gossip about the Duke, who had rejected his beautiful betrothed for her plain cousin, speculation running wild about what could possibly have motivated such a shocking reversal. Some whispered that Beatrice must have been discovered in some compromising situation. Others suggested that Georgiana had used some form of witchcraft or manipulation to ensnare the Duke, and still others claimed the entire betrothal to Beatrice had been a misunderstanding from the start, and the Duke had always intended to marry the scholarly Miss Georgiana. Lord Ashwood had indeed blustered and threatened legal action, but Nathaniel Brandon's solicitors had constructed the loophole in the betrothal contract with such careful attention to plausible deniability that any challenge would have required exposing the fiction, which would have brought even greater humiliation to the Fairfax family. In the end, Lord Ashwood had accepted a substantial financial settlement from the duchy in exchange for his silence and agreement, enough money to save his estates from the creditors Georgiana had not known were circling, and he retreated to Ashwood Hall to lick his wounds and avoid society's knowing looks. Beatrice had taken to her bed for a week following the rejected engagement, weeping and raging by turns, but youth and vanity proved resilient, and within a month she had emerged with renewed determination to find a husband who would appreciate her properly. The ton had expected her to retreat from society in shame, but Beatrice surprised everyone by holding her head high and declaring that she had had a narrow escape from a duke who clearly valued dusty books over proper feminine accomplishments, and she would find a husband whose tastes were more aligned with her own. 6 months after the wedding, as autumn painted the Northumberland countryside in shades of amber and gold, Georgiana stood in the library at Wentworth Abbey and marvelled at the transformation that had occurred not just in the physical space, but in her entire existence. The Abbey itself was a magnificent estate, far grander than Ashwood Hall, with grounds that stretched for miles and architecture that dated back 3 centuries. But when Edmund had first brought her here as his bride, she had found it curiously lifeless. A museum of inherited treasures, maintained by servants but not truly inhabited. Rooms kept pristine but empty of warmth or purpose. Together they had changed that, breathing life and meaning into the ancient stones. The library had been Edmund's wedding gift to her, a vast room on the ground floor with windows overlooking the rose gardens, and he had spared no expense in expanding the collection and creating a research centre that would honour her father's memory while advancing the field of classical studies. Scholars came from Oxford and Cambridge, from universities in Germany and France and Italy, to study the manuscripts and artifacts Georgiana had assembled, to collaborate on research projects, to engage in the kind of intellectual exchange her father had valued above all else. The house hummed with conversation and debate, visiting academics, staying for weeks or months at a time. And Georgiana had discovered that she possessed a gift for facilitating these scholarly communities, for asking questions that sparked new insights, for connecting researchers whose work might complement each other in unexpected ways. She had established the Fairfax Research Centre in her father's name, funded generously by the duchy, and already it was gaining recognition as one of the premier institutions for the study of ancient Greek culture and archaeology. Edmund had thrown himself into the management of his estates with an energy and innovation that surprised his stewards and tenants alike, implementing agricultural reforms based on the latest scientific methods, establishing schools on his lands so that the children of his workers might receive education regardless of their family's ability to pay, creating programs to support widows and orphans and those who had fallen on hard times through no fault of their own. He had shed the typical trappings of aristocratic life, the endless rounds of social calls and fashionable entertainments, instead focusing on work that he found meaningful, that allowed him to use his position and wealth to create genuine positive change. He and Georgiana made an unconventional duke and duchess, preferring quiet evenings discussing philosophy to glittering balls, hosting scholars and reformers rather than the cream of the ton, but they were happy in ways that defied society's narrow definitions of proper aristocratic behavior. On a particular evening in late October, as the sun set early and cast golden light through the tall windows of their private library within the larger Abbey library, Georgiana sat in her favorite chair, reviewing the page proofs of her father's final manuscript. She had spent 6 months completing the work he had left unfinished at his death, analyzing the pottery fragments from his final excavation, writing the chapters on dating methodology and cultural significance that he had outlined but never drafted, and now the book was going to press with both their names on the title page, Professor Edmund Fairfax and Lady Georgiana Wentworth. The Times had already published a review calling it groundbreaking work that would reshape understanding of Athenian domestic life, and the Archaeological Society had written to inform her that they wished to award her father a posthumous medal for his contributions to the field. She held the letter from the society in her hands, reading it again with a mixture of pride and grief, wishing her father could have lived to see his work completed and recognized, yet knowing that he would have been proud of her for finishing what he started. They are calling it groundbreaking work, completed by his daughter, the Duchess of Wentworth, she said aloud, looking up to where Edmund sat across from her in his own chair, reviewing reports from his estate managers. Father would have been proud. Edmund set aside his papers and smiled at her, that particular smile he reserved for moments when she accomplished something significant, a look of such genuine pleasure in her success that it still had the power to make her heart skip. He would have been proud, not because you are a duchess, he said gently, but because you are a brilliant scholar who had the courage and dedication to complete complex work to the highest standards. The title merely gives you the platform to be heard, Georgiana. The work itself is what matters, and it is exceptional. He rose and moved to the small table where their tea service sat, an elaborate silver set that had been in the Wentworth family for generations, and proceeded to pour her tea with exaggerated footman formality, his posture perfect, his movements precise. "More tea, Your Grace," he intoned in a carefully neutral servant's voice, and Georgiana laughed as she always did when he performed this particular ritual, the private joke that never seemed to lose its charm. "You know I fell in love with you when you were Edmund the footman," she said, accepting the cup he offered with both hands, their fingers brushing in the familiar gesture that still sent warmth through her. "Sometimes I miss him, that quiet man who served my breakfast and said so little but saw so much." Edmund settled back into his chair, his own cup in hand, and his expression turned thoughtful and tender. "He is still here," he said softly. "He is the part of me that knows the truest wealth is not the title or the estate or the social position. It is this, you and me and our work and our life together. Everything else is just livery I wear for the world, the costume of duke that I put on when necessary, but which has nothing to do with who I really am. Who I really am is the man who spent 3 years watching you move through Ashwood Hall being invisible to everyone else, and falling more deeply in love with you every day, even when I did not yet have the courage to act on those feelings. Georgiana set down her teacup and moved to sit on the arm of Edmund's chair, a casual intimacy that would have scandalized proper society, but which felt natural and right in the privacy of their library. "Do you ever regret those 3 years?" she asked, a question that had troubled her occasionally in the months since their marriage. Living as a servant, hiding who you were, wasting time that you could have spent managing your estates or taking your place in society? Edmund's arm came around her waist, holding her secure, and he looked up at her with absolute certainty. "Never," he said firmly. "Those years taught me that worth is not bestowed by birth, but earned by character, that the accidents of title and inheritance have nothing to do with a person's true value. You were invisible to everyone else at Ashwood, overlooked and undervalued, but you were the only person I truly saw, the only one whose opinions mattered, whose company I sought, whose approval I craved. And in seeing you, in learning to value what you valued and respect what you respected, I finally saw myself clearly too, saw how empty my life had been before, how much of it had been performance and obligation with no genuine meaning underneath. Those 3 years of service were the most honest years of my life until I married you, and I would not trade them for anything." The sound of voices drifted in from the main library, where several visiting scholars were engaged in animated debate about recent discoveries at Pompeii, and Georgiana smiled at the evidence of life and purpose filling the ancient house. A letter had arrived that afternoon, brought by special messenger from London, and she retrieved it now from the side table where she had left it, passing it to Edmund with a sense of satisfaction at the news it contained. "Beatrice has married," she said, watching Edmund's face as he read the brief note from her uncle. A merchant named Thomas Gardiner, extremely wealthy from trade with India, well below her in social standing by aristocratic measures, but apparently well suited to her in temperament. Uncle writes that she is happy, that she has taken charge of managing several of her husband's business ventures and shows considerable aptitude for commerce. He sounds rather bewildered by the whole affair, as if he cannot quite understand how his daughter found contentment in a match that brings no title or social elevation. Edmund finished reading and set the letter aside with a thoughtful expression. "Good for Beatrice," he said, and sounded as if he meant it. She needed someone who would value her for her strengths rather than simply her beauty and connections. Someone who would give her real work to do rather than relegating her to ornamental status. A merchant who needs a partner in managing his enterprises will appreciate her organizational skills and her social confidence in ways a duke seeking a decorative wife never could. She found her own path to fulfillment, just as you did, just as we both did. It seems none of us fit the roles society assigned us, and we are all better for having the courage to step outside those constraints. The thought of Beatrice managing business affairs and thriving in trade rather than aristocratic society struck Georgiana as deliciously ironic. The beautiful cousin who had spent years mocking Georgiana's intellectual pursuits, now finding her own purpose in work that society would consider equally inappropriate for a lady. Perhaps they were not so different after all. She and Beatrice, both women seeking meaning and agency in a world that offered them only ornamental roles, both finding happiness by defying expectations and building lives on their own terms. "Uncle Ashwood has lost the social standing he craved," Edmund observed, returning to the letter, "but it does not seem to have taught him anything." He still measures worth in titles and connections, still cannot understand why his daughters chose as they did. Some people never learn to value what truly matters. Georgiana thought of her uncle, bitter and diminished in his provincial estate, clinging to the empty prestige of having been almost connected to a duke, and felt only a distant pity for him. He had taught her an important lesson, though, shown her through negative example what happened when one valued position over character, appearance over substance, and she was grateful for that education, even if it had been painful to acquire. The evening deepened, the golden light fading to blue dusk, and Edmund lit candles around their private sitting area, creating a warm glow that pushed back the autumn darkness. They returned to their respective work, Georgiana making notes on a new research project examining trade routes between Athens and Sparta, Edmund reviewing plans for a new school he intended to establish in the village nearest Wentworth Abbey. But the silence between them was comfortable and companionable. The easy quiet of two people who need not fill every moment with conversation because their connection runs deeper than words. After perhaps an hour, Georgiana set aside her notes and simply watched Edmund as he worked, this man who had transformed her life so completely, who had seen her when she was invisible to everyone else, who had chosen her over duty and obligation and society's expectations. I never thanked you properly. I thanked you for serving me tea all those mornings at Ashwood, she said softly, drawing his attention from his papers. It was the kindest thing anyone ever did for me, being present and constant and there every morning without fail. I did not understand it at the time, did not recognize it for what it was, but you were showing me every day that I mattered, that someone saw me even when I felt most invisible. Edmund set aside his work and reached for her hand, bringing it to his lips in a gesture that managed to be both courtly and deeply intimate. "It was never service, my love," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It was devotion from the very first morning, though it took me far too long to understand that myself. I told myself I was observing the household, studying the family I would join, performing my duties as a footman, but the truth was, I was falling in love with you one teacup at a time, one perfectly ordinary morning after another. You became the center of my existence without my even realizing it was happening. And by the time I understood what you meant to me, I was so thoroughly caught that escape was impossible and undesirable. Those mornings serving your tea were the holiest ritual of my life, the moments when I could be near you and care for you in the only way my false position allowed." Georgiana felt tears prick at her eyes, overwhelmed by the gift of being loved like this, of being chosen and valued and seen so completely. She thought of the past 6 months, of the life they had built together at Wentworth Abbey, of the work they were both doing that gave meaning to their days and purpose to their privilege. She thought of the research centre bearing her father's name, of the scholars who gathered here to advance human understanding of the ancient world, of the schools Edmund was establishing, and the reforms he was implementing that would improve the lives of hundreds of people who depended on the duchy. She thought of how invisible she had felt at Ashwood Hall, how she had believed herself to be without value or purpose, and marvelled at the transformation that love and partnership had wrought. "Being invisible taught me to see clearly," she said finally, articulating a truth that had only recently become clear to her. "When no one is looking at you, when you are overlooked and dismissed, you learn to observe rather than perform, to notice details others miss, to develop your own judgments independent of society's opinions. Those 3 years at Ashwood, when I felt most worthless, were actually preparing me for this, teaching me to value substance over appearance, character over position, genuine connection over social performance. I learned to see people as they truly are rather than as they present themselves, and that is how I saw you, Edmund. saw past the footman's livery to the man beneath, recognized the intelligence and kindness and integrity that you were hiding from everyone else. Edmund pulled her from her chair into his lap, holding her close, and they sat together in the candle-lit library, listening to the distant sounds of the house around them, the scholars debating in the main library, the servants moving through their evening routines, the wind beginning to rise outside as autumn asserted itself. Through the tall windows, Georgiana could see the first stars appearing in the darkening sky, pinpricks of light against the gathering darkness, and she thought about how much had changed since that winter evening at Ashwood, when Beatrice announced her engagement, and Georgiana felt the walls of her small, constrained life closing in completely. She had believed then that she understood the boundaries of what was possible for someone in her position, had accepted that invisibility and dependence were her permanent conditions, but Edmund had shown her that the roles society assigned were not immutable facts, but rather costumes that could be shed, that identities could be chosen rather than simply accepted, that love could transform everything. The tea service sat on the table beside them, the silver gleaming in the candlelight, and Georgiana reached out to touch the handle of the pot that Edmund had used to serve her just an hour earlier. This simple object had been present at every significant moment of their relationship, she realized, from those early morning services at Ashwood, when Edmund was still just the invisible footman, through their midnight conversations in the library, to this evening at Wentworth Abbey, where they sat as equals and partners building a life of meaning together. The ritual had remained constant, even as everything else transformed, the pouring of tea from pot to cup, a thread of continuity connecting the woman she had been to the woman she had become. Sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the smallest gestures, she said quietly, more to herself than to Edmund. A footman serving tea day after day, waiting patiently for the moment when both people could finally see each other clearly, when the barriers of position and pretense could fall away and genuine connection could emerge. We built our love in teacups and book margins, in stolen glances across crowded rooms and midnight conversations about ancient philosophy, in all the small, ordinary moments that no one else noticed or valued. That is what made it real, Edmund, not grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but rather the steady accumulation of daily acts of care and attention, the choosing of each other again and again in ways too small for anyone else to see. Edmund's arms tightened around her, and she felt him press a kiss to the top of her head, a gesture of tenderness that still had the power to make her feel cherished and safe. "You are the scholar and the poet both," he murmured against her hair. "You take our story and make it beautiful. Find meaning in what I thought were merely my desperate attempts to be near you without revealing myself. But you are right that love is built in small moments as much as large ones, in the daily choosing and the patient waiting as much as in the dramatic revelations. I waited 3 years to tell you the truth, 3 years of serving your tea and watching you and falling deeper in love while trapped in a situation of my own making. It was agony, and it was bliss, torture and transcendence, the best and worst years of my life all at once. And now we have this, a life beyond anything I imagined possible when I first took that position as footman, a partnership that validates everything I believed about what marriage could be if built on genuine respect and intellectual equality." The candles burned lower, casting dancing shadows on the book-lined walls, and outside the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending autumn leaves swirling past the glass. Soon it would be winter again, the cycle completing itself. But this year Georgiana would face the cold months not as a dependent relation huddled in a drafty corner of someone else's house, but as the mistress of Wentworth Abbey, as a published scholar and a duchess, and most importantly as Edmund's chosen partner. She thought of all the women like her, the ones living in the margins of other people's lives, the poor relations and spinsters and widows who were invisible to society, overlooked and undervalued, and she hoped that somehow her story might reach them, might offer evidence that transformation was possible, that being seen and chosen and valued was not reserved only for the young and beautiful and wealthy. Every person possessed inherent worth, regardless of their social position or marital status or material circumstances, and the right partner was one who recognized and honored that worth, who offered freedom rather than constraint, partnership rather than possession. Edmund had given her all of that and more, had seen her when she was invisible and chosen her when she believed herself unchosen, had offered her not just his title and wealth, but his genuine self, flawed and vulnerable and courageously honest. In the main library beyond their private sanctuary, she could hear the scholars beginning to disperse for the evening, calling good nights to each other, their voices warm with the satisfaction of productive intellectual labor. This was the world she and Edmund had built together, a place where ideas mattered more than bloodlines, where contribution to human knowledge was valued over social position, where people were seen for who they truly were rather than what accidents of birth had made them. It was not perfect. There were still constraints imposed by their positions, still expectations they could not entirely escape, still moments when the weight of title and obligation pressed down heavily. But they faced those challenges together, partners in the truest sense, and that made all the difference. Georgiana shifted in Edmund's arms, turning to face him directly, and cupped his face in her hands, studying the features that had become so dear to her, the dark eyes that had watched her for 3 years before she even knew to look back, the mouth that could quote Aristotle and discuss archaeological methodology and kiss her until she forgot her own name, the face of the man who had transformed her world. "I love you," she said simply, the words inadequate to express the depth and complexity of what she felt, but still necessary to speak aloud. "I love you for seeing me, for choosing me, for building this life with me. I love you for the footman you pretended to be, and the duke you reluctantly are, and the man you actually are beneath all the roles and performances. Thank you for waiting for me, for serving me tea all those mornings, for being patient until I could finally see what was right in front of me all along." Edmund's answer was a kiss that tasted of tea and promise and coming home, and when they finally drew apart, he rested his forehead against hers and whispered the words that had become their private benediction, the truth that anchored everything else. "From the very first morning," he said, and she knew he meant the devotion, the love, the choosing of her above all others. From the very first morning and every morning after, now and always. Outside the library windows, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, the same constellations that had looked down on the Greek philosophers whose words filled the shelves around them, the same sky that had witnessed countless human dramas of love and loss and transformation. But here in this moment, in this library at Wentworth Abbey, with tea growing cold in delicate cups and candles burning low and the autumn wind singing outside, Georgiana Fairfax Wentworth, formerly invisible and now gloriously seen, sat in her husband's arms and knew herself to be blessed beyond measure, to have found in the most unlikely of places and the most impossible of circumstances the partnership her father had always told her was worth waiting for, worth fighting for, worth building a life around. The tea service would be there again tomorrow morning, she knew. Edmund would pour for her as he always did now, the ritual transformed from service to sacrament, from duty to devotion, from the smallest of gestures into the foundation of everything that mattered. And she would accept the cup as she always did, with hands that no longer trembled, with a heart that knew itself loved, with the quiet certainty that she had finally found her place in the world, not by becoming someone different, but by being seen clearly as exactly who she was.